"The deal is dead," one Japanese executive whispered, and only one person in the room understood why. The private dining hall atop the Imperial Crown Manhattan glowed beneath crystal chandeliers and golden evening light. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the New York skyline stretching for miles beyond the glass. Around a polished mahogany table sat some of the most influential people in international business. Investors, advisors, corporate attorneys, executives from Tokyo. At the center of it all sat Victoria Sterling, a white billionaire CEO whose reputation had been built on impossible successes. At 42, she had transformed Sterling Global Ventures into one of the fastest-growing companies in the world. Tonight was supposed to be another victory. A strategic partnership with a Japanese technology conglomerate was expected to open billions of dollars in future opportunities. Every detail had been prepared for months. Every presentation had been reviewed. Every guest had been carefully selected. Everything was supposed to go perfectly. Then Victoria said one sentence. The translator repeated her words in Japanese, and the atmosphere changed instantly. Naomi Carter noticed it before anyone else. She stood near the back of the room carrying a silver tray filled with sparkling water glasses. At 28 years old, she had worked enough high-end events to recognize subtle shifts in mood. Most guests never noticed waitstaff. Naomi preferred it that way. People revealed more when they thought nobody was paying attention. The Japanese executives exchanged brief looks. One of them lowered his eyes. Another quietly adjusted his glasses. A third leaned toward a colleague and spoke softly in Japanese. The translator continued smiling, apparently unaware of anything unusual. Most people around the table remained focused on their meals. Victoria continued speaking confidently about future growth and international cooperation. Yet Naomi felt a knot forming in her stomach. Something was wrong. Very wrong. She moved carefully between tables, serving drinks while listening. The conversation in Japanese became more frequent. The expressions became more guarded. Several executives who had appeared enthusiastic earlier now seemed distant, concerned, even disappointed. Victoria did not notice. Neither did her advisors. They were focused on numbers, forecasts, and presentations. Naomi heard another quiet comment in Japanese. This time her grip tightened around the tray, because she understood every word. Years earlier, life had taken her thousands of miles from New York. A scholarship had carried her across the Pacific Ocean to Tokyo. What began as a one-year academic opportunity became nearly 6 years of study, work, and immersion. She learned the language. She learned the culture. Most importantly, she learned how meaning could disappear when words were translated carelessly. Tonight, that knowledge sat heavily on her mind. One of the Japanese executives spoke quietly to another. If that is truly her position, there is no reason to continue. Naomi felt her heart skip. That was not what Victoria had meant at all. The problem was not Victoria's statement. The problem was how it had been translated. Naomi glanced toward the translator. He continued smiling politely, completely unaware. Or perhaps not unaware. Naomi could not tell. Victoria finished her remarks and raised her glass. To a successful future together. Guests around the table responded politely. Glasses lifted. Smiles appeared. Yet the enthusiasm felt forced now. Hello. The Japanese delegation offered courteous nods, but Naomi could see the damage had already been done. A misunderstanding had taken root, and it was growing. She looked toward Victoria. The billionaire CEO appeared confident, composed, and completely unaware that the room was slipping away from her. Naomi hesitated. Speaking up would be unthinkable. She was a waitress. These were billionaires, executives, and international negotiators. Yet every instinct told her the night was moving toward disaster. As another Japanese executive quietly pushed aside a folder containing the partnership documents, Naomi realized something chilling. Everyone in the room believed they understood what Victoria Sterling had said. Almost nobody actually did. Naomi Carter spent the next 10 minutes moving between tables while pretending nothing was wrong. She refilled water glasses, collected empty plates, smiled politely whenever guests thanked her. On the surface, she looked like every other waitress working the event. Inside, however, her mind raced. The misunderstanding was growing worse with every passing minute. Across the room, Victoria Sterling continued speaking with confidence. The billionaire CEO discussed innovation, expansion, and future collaboration. Her words were thoughtful, respectful, strategic. Yet Naomi knew the Japanese delegation was hearing something very different. She glanced toward the translator again. He stood near the presentation screen, listening attentively and occasionally assisting with communication. Nothing about his behavior appeared suspicious. If anything, he looked professional. That made the situation even more confusing. Was he making honest mistakes? Or was something else happening? Naomi was not ready to draw conclusions. She only knew the translations were changing the meaning of Victoria's message. One of the Japanese executives quietly excused himself from the table and stepped toward a nearby window overlooking Manhattan. Another followed. Naomi carried a tray in their direction. As she approached, she overheard their conversation. She clearly does not trust partnership governance, one executive said in Japanese. The other nodded. And she appears unwilling to share strategic authority. Naomi nearly stopped walking. That was not what Victoria had said. Not even close. Earlier, Victoria had emphasized transparency and long-term cooperation. Yet the translation had somehow transformed her words into something that sounded controlling and dismissive. Naomi continued walking, but concern tightened in her chest. The misunderstanding was no longer minor. It was affecting decisions. Back at the main table, investors were discussing expansion forecasts. Attorneys reviewed documents. Nobody seemed aware that two entirely different conversations were happening simultaneously. One in English, one in Japanese, and they were moving in opposite directions. Victoria raised another important point regarding future leadership. Structures. The translator spoke. Several Japanese executives immediately exchanged uncomfortable looks. Naomi heard one of them sigh quietly. Another closed a folder. The gesture seemed small, but Naomi recognized its significance. People did not close folders when negotiations were improving. They closed them when they were preparing to walk away. A chill ran through her. She moved toward the service station near the back of the room and tried to focus on work. Stay out of it, she told herself. This was not her responsibility. She was a waitress, not a consultant, not an interpreter, not a corporate advisor. Yet the words she had heard refused to leave her mind. Years earlier in Tokyo, one of her professors had taught a lesson she never forgot. Translation was not simply about words. It was about intent. When intent disappeared, trust disappeared with it. Naomi looked back toward Victoria. The CEO was answering questions now. Calm, professional, completely unaware that her answers were creating growing concern among the people she hoped to impress. Then something happened that made Naomi's pulse quicken. One of the senior Japanese executives spoke directly to a colleague seated beside him. If this is truly her position, the board will never approve the partnership. Naomi froze. The board. That meant the consequences extended far beyond tonight's dinner. A misunderstanding here could affect months of negotiations and potentially billions of dollars in future business. She looked toward Victoria again. For the first time, Naomi noticed something else. Victoria was beginning to sense that something felt wrong. The CEO's confident smile appeared slightly strained. Her eyes occasionally drifted toward the Japanese delegation as if she could feel their enthusiasm fading without understanding why. Human instincts often recognized problems before logic explained them. Victoria knew something was slipping away. She simply did not know what. Naomi took a slow breath. The room felt smaller now. The sounds of silverware and conversation seemed distant. Her mind returned to Tokyo, to lecture halls, to language exams, to years spent mastering a skill nobody in this room knew she possessed. Then she looked at the Japanese executives. She looked at Victoria Sterling, and she realized she might be the only person in the entire building who understood exactly what was happening. Naomi Carter spent the next several minutes fighting a battle nobody else could see. Every instinct told her to remain silent. She had worked too hard to earn her position at Imperial Crown Manhattan. The restaurant's clientele included celebrities, executives, and politicians. Employees were expected to provide flawless service, not interfere with international business negotiations. Speaking up could embarrass the translator. It could anger management. It could cost her job. Yet remaining silent carried a different cost. She watched as another carefully crafted statement from Victoria Sterling traveled across the room, passed through the translator, and arrived at the Japanese delegation carrying an entirely different meaning. Victoria was discussing collaborative leadership. The translation made it sound like centralized control. Victoria was emphasizing mutual trust. The translation suggested caution and skepticism. Small changes, subtle changes. But in high-level negotiations, subtle changes could destroy everything. Naomi carried a fresh pot of coffee toward the table. As she approached, she heard one of the Japanese executives quietly address another. She does not seem interested in a true partnership. The second executive nodded. Perhaps we misunderstood her company from the beginning. Naomi lowered her eyes and continued pouring coffee, but inside she felt a growing sense of urgency. They had misunderstood nothing. They were being given the wrong message. Across the room, Victoria answered another question from the delegation. Her response was thoughtful and diplomatic. Years of leadership experience showed in every word. Yet the reaction she received made no sense. The Japanese executives responded with increasingly formal language. Their smiles became smaller. Their body language became more distant. Victoria noticed it now. Naomi could see the confusion in her eyes. The billionaire CEO had entered the evening expecting momentum. Instead, she was encountering resistance she could not explain. One of her senior advisors leaned toward her and whispered something. Victoria nodded politely, but the uncertainty remained. Naomi recognized that expression. It was the look of someone who knew a problem existed but could not identify its source. Then another moment changed everything. A senior Japanese executive stood and offered a short toast. The room fell respectfully silent. He spoke in Japanese first. Naomi listened carefully. "We appreciate the invitation and the hospitality shown this evening," he said. "However, true partnerships require shared values and mutual understanding." Several people around the room smiled politely, unaware of the deeper meaning behind the words. Then the translator delivered the English version. "We are excited about the future opportunities ahead." Naomi nearly dropped the coffee pot. That was not what the executive had said at all. Not even close. The original statement was cautious, diplomatic, almost a warning. The translated version sounded optimistic. Suddenly, Naomi realized something frightening. The mistranslations were moving in both directions. Victoria's words were being altered before reaching the Japanese delegation. The delegation's concerns were being softened before reaching Victoria. Neither side understood what the other actually believed. The entire evening was unfolding inside a manufactured illusion. Naomi stepped back toward the service area, her pulse racing. This was bigger than a few incorrect phrases. The two groups were conducting entirely different conversations while believing they were discussing the same thing. She looked toward the translator again. For the first time, she noticed something she had missed earlier. Whenever sensitive topics arose, he appeared unusually careful, deliberate, as if choosing words that served a specific purpose. Naomi could not prove anything. Perhaps she was imagining it. Perhaps not. Then she saw something else. Near the far end of the table sat Gavin Pierce, one of the investment board members involved in the proposed partnership. Throughout the evening, he had spoken very little. Yet every time a mistranslation shifted the atmosphere, he seemed strangely comfortable, almost pleased. The observation unsettled her. Naomi looked from Gavin to the translator and then toward Victoria Sterling. The billionaire CEO was still fighting to save a negotiation she did not realize was being sabotaged by words she never actually spoke. And for the first time that evening, Naomi understood that staying silent might be the most dangerous decision of all. Naomi Carter stood motionless beside the service station while the dinner continued around her. Crystal glasses reflected the warm glow of chandeliers. Quiet music drifted through the elegant dining hall. Guests smiled politely and exchanged business cards. To everyone else, the evening still looked successful. Naomi knew better. The entire negotiation was balancing on a misunderstanding that was becoming more dangerous by the minute. She looked toward Victoria Sterling again. The billionaire CEO was answering questions from the Japanese delegation with patience and professionalism. Every response demonstrated respect. Every answer reflected a sincere desire for partnership. Yet by the time her words passed through the translator, they arrived carrying a different meaning. Naomi felt her pulse quicken. If she remained silent, the deal would almost certainly collapse. If she spoke up, she could create a scene in front of some of the most powerful people in the room. Neither option felt safe. Then another exchange pushed her to the edge. One of the Japanese executives asked a careful question about future decision-making authority. Victoria smiled and answered immediately. Major decisions should always reflect mutual trust and shared goals. It was a simple statement. Clear, respectful, reasonable. The translator spoke. Naomi's eyes widened. The Japanese version suggested something completely different. It implied that final authority would remain primarily with Victoria's company. Several members of the delegation immediately exchanged concerned looks. One executive slowly placed his fork down on the table. Another folded his hands and leaned back in his chair. The reaction was unmistakable. Trust was disappearing. Naomi looked toward Gavin Pierce. Once again, she noticed the same thing. Every time tension increased, he seemed strangely comfortable. Not relieved, not surprised. Comfortable, as if events were unfolding exactly as expected. The observation sent a chill through her. Then she heard something that changed everything. A senior executive from Tokyo leaned toward a colleague and spoke quietly in Japanese. "We should end discussions after dessert." Naomi felt her stomach drop. End discussions. The partnership was slipping away. Months of preparation. Thousands of hours of work. Opportunities worth billions of dollars. All because two sides of a conversation were hearing different realities. She looked around the room. Nobody else appeared aware of what was happening. Victoria certainly was not. Her advisors continued discussing future projects. Investors reviewed forecasts. Attorneys chatted politely over coffee. Only Naomi could see the invisible wall growing between the two sides of the table. Her hands tightened around the tray she carried. Years earlier in Tokyo, one of her professors had once said something she never forgot. Language creates bridges. But when language is distorted, bridges become barriers. Tonight, that barrier was becoming impossible to ignore. Another round of questions began. Another translation followed. Another misunderstanding spread through the room. Naomi finally reached a decision. She could not stay silent anymore. Not because of the deal. Not because of the money. Because the truth mattered. She carefully set her tray on a nearby service counter. The simple movement felt far heavier than it should have. Across the room, Victoria was responding to yet another question. The Japanese delegation listened politely, but their disappointment was becoming impossible to hide. Naomi took a slow breath. Every instinct warned her against what she was about to do. Waitresses were not supposed to interrupt international negotiations. They were not supposed to challenge translators. They were certainly not supposed to address billionaire CEOs during private business dinners. Yet she knew exactly what would happen if she did nothing. The room suddenly felt quieter, smaller, as if the entire evening were narrowing toward a single moment. Naomi stepped away from the service station. One step, then another. She walked toward the main table where executives, attorneys, and investors sat beneath the golden lights. Victoria paused in the middle of a response as she noticed movement approaching. Several guests turned their heads. Conversations faded. Naomi stopped beside the table. For a brief second, uncertainty flashed across her face. Then it disappeared. She looked toward the Japanese delegation. She looked toward Victoria Sterling. And finally she spoke. Not in English. In flawless Japanese. The room went completely silent. The silence that followed felt almost unreal. Crystal glasses remained suspended halfway to lips. Conversations vanished. Even the soft music drifting through the dining hall seemed distant. Naomi Carter stood beside the table, her black apron still tied neatly around her waist, while every eye in the room fixed upon her. The Japanese words she had spoken were flawless. Not hesitant. Not memorized. Fluent. Natural. One of the senior executives from Tokyo stared at her in disbelief. "You speak Japanese?" he asked. Naomi nodded respectfully. "Yes, sir." Across the table, Victoria Sterling looked equally stunned. Moments earlier, she had been struggling to understand why the atmosphere had shifted against her. Now a waitress she had barely noticed was speaking directly to her international partners in their native language. The translator's expression changed immediately. His confidence vanished. For the first time that evening, uncertainty appeared in his eyes. Naomi took a careful breath. She knew every second mattered. "I apologize for interrupting," she said in Japanese. "But there appears to be a misunderstanding." Several executives leaned forward. One of them immediately responded. "What kind of misunderstanding?" Naomi glanced toward Victoria. "Many of her statements have not been reaching you with their intended meaning." The room became still again. The translator quickly stepped forward. "I believe there has been some confusion." Naomi turned toward him calmly. "Then let us clarify it together." Her voice remained respectful, professional, yet impossible to ignore. Victoria watched closely. Something about Naomi's confidence told her this was not a guess. The waitress knew exactly what she was talking about. One of the Japanese executives opened a folder and pointed toward notes from earlier discussions. Then tell us, he said. What did she mean when she spoke about governance authority? Naomi answered immediately. She repeated Victoria's original statement and then carefully explained its intended meaning in Japanese. The reaction was instant. Several executives exchanged surprised looks. One even laughed softly in relief. That is completely different, he said. Another nodded. That interpretation aligns with everything we discussed during previous meetings. Victoria felt a wave of confusion mixed with realization. She looked from Naomi to the translator, then back to the Japanese delegation. For the first time all evening, the pieces began falling into place. She had not been losing the room because of her ideas. The room had been responding to ideas she never actually expressed. Naomi continued. One by one, she clarified several key statements from earlier in the evening. Each correction produced the same reaction. Concern turned into understanding. Distance became engagement. Questions that had seemed hostile suddenly made sense. Across the room, Gavin Pierce no longer looked comfortable. Naomi noticed immediately. Every clarification seemed to make him more uneasy. His eyes shifted frequently between the translator and the Japanese executives. Victoria noticed it too. The billionaire CEO had built an empire by studying people, and Gavin's reaction was becoming impossible to ignore. Then one Japanese executive said something that changed the entire evening. If these translations are accurate, then we may have been evaluating this partnership based on information that was never actually presented. The statement landed heavily across the table. Nobody argued. Nobody could, because everyone had just witnessed the same thing. Misunderstanding after misunderstanding being corrected in real time. Naomi looked toward Victoria. For a brief moment, their eyes met. The waitress who had been invisible all evening and the billionaire CEO, who had unknowingly been fighting the wrong battle, shared the same realization. The dinner had not been falling apart because of business disagreements. It had been falling apart because somebody had been controlling the conversation between two sides that could not fully understand each other. And as the Japanese delegation began asking Naomi to clarify more of the discussion directly, one uncomfortable truth became impossible to ignore. The evening's biggest problem was no longer the misunderstanding itself. It was discovering who had benefited from it. The dining hall remained unusually quiet even after conversations resumed. Something fundamental had changed. The Japanese delegation was no longer relying on the official translator. More and more, their attention shifted toward Naomi Carter. Questions that had previously traveled through intermediaries now came directly to her. Each time she clarified a statement, the atmosphere improved. Trust slowly returned. Yet as confidence returned to one side of the room, tension grew on the other. Victoria Sterling sat silently for a moment, studying everything that had happened. Throughout her career, she had learned that major problems rarely appeared alone. When one hidden issue surfaced, others often followed. Naomi's corrections had already revealed multiple translation discrepancies. The obvious question was why. Honest mistakes happened. Repeated mistakes that consistently benefited one outcome were harder to explain. One of the Japanese executives turned toward Naomi. May I ask where you learned Japanese? The question seemed simple, but everyone in the room listened carefully. Naomi hesitated before answering. I studied in Tokyo. Several eyebrows rose immediately. For how long? Another executive asked. Almost 6 years, Naomi replied. Surprise spread around the table. Victoria looked genuinely stunned. 6 years. The waitress serving drinks had spent nearly as much time in Japan as some international business consultants. One executive smiled warmly. Your language skills are exceptional. Naomi thanked him politely. She looked slightly uncomfortable with the attention. Victoria noticed that too. Naomi never seemed interested in impressing anyone. She simply wanted people to understand one another correctly. The difference mattered. Then another question came from the Japanese delegation. Why are you working here? Naomi laughed softly. The question sounded familiar. Because life does not always follow the plan. Several people smiled. The answer carried a quiet honesty that needed no further explanation. Across the room, however, Gavin Pierce did not smile. Victoria noticed. The more the evening recovered, the more uneasy he appeared. She had worked with investors long enough to recognize behavioral changes. Earlier, he had seemed relaxed. Now he checked his phone repeatedly. He interrupted conversations more often. He appeared eager to move discussions forward before additional questions emerged. Victoria filed the observation away. Then one of the Japanese executives asked Naomi to clarify another statement from earlier in the evening. As she translated, something unexpected happened. A senior member of the delegation opened his notes and compared them to remarks made during a private meeting held weeks earlier. His expression changed immediately. "That is interesting," he said. The room became attentive again. "What is interesting?" Victoria asked. The executive looked down at his notes. "Several concerns we believe came directly from your company now sound completely different when explained this way." Silence followed. Victoria leaned forward slightly. "Different how?" The executive reviewed a page. "We were told your company intended to maintain exclusive authority over several strategic decisions." Victoria frowned. "We never proposed that." Naomi translated both sides carefully. The executive nodded. "That is exactly the problem." A chill moved through the room. Suddenly, the issue extended beyond tonight's dinner. If previous conversations had been distorted as well, the misunderstanding might have existed for months. Victoria exchanged a look with Naomi. Neither woman said anything. Neither needed to. They were beginning to reach the same conclusion. The problem was larger than a single evening. Much larger. Then one of the Japanese executives slowly closed his notebook and spoke words that immediately captured everyone's attention. "I believe we should review every translation associated with this partnership." The room fell silent once more. And for the first time that night, Gavin Pierce looked genuinely worried. The suggestion changed the mood of the room immediately. Review every translation associated with the partnership. What had sounded like a simple recommendation was actually a threat to every assumption that had guided months of negotiations. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The Japanese executives exchanged thoughtful looks. Victoria Sterling remained calm, but Naomi could see her mind working rapidly. The billionaire CEO had spent years building companies by recognizing patterns others overlooked, and a pattern was beginning to emerge. Misunderstandings that consistently pushed discussions in the same direction. Translation choices that repeatedly weakened trust. Concerns that seemed to appear from nowhere. One incident might have been accidental. Months of incidents were something else entirely. "I support a complete review," Victoria finally said. Her voice was steady, professional, confident. The statement immediately shifted attention toward the translator. He forced a polite smile. "That may not be necessary." Several heads turned. The response felt strange. If the translations were accurate, a review should have presented no problem. One of the Japanese executives noticed it as well. "Why would verification be unnecessary?" he asked. The translator adjusted his tie. "Because misunderstandings happen naturally in international business." The answer sounded reasonable, yet nobody seemed satisfied by it. Naomi watched carefully. Earlier in the evening, she had doubted herself. Now she felt increasingly certain that something deeper was happening. Across the table, Gavin Pierce suddenly entered the conversation. "Perhaps we should focus on moving forward instead of revisiting old discussions." The timing caught Victoria's attention immediately. Gavin had spent most of the evening observing. Now, just as a comprehensive review was proposed, he appeared eager to stop it. "Moving forward requires trust," Victoria replied. "And trust requires clarity." Gavin nodded politely, but the tension in his expression remained. One of the Japanese executives opened a digital folder on his tablet. "I have records from several previous meetings." He looked toward Naomi. "Would you be willing to review a few examples?" The room became quiet again. Naomi hesitated. She was still wearing a waitress uniform, still standing beside tables she had been serving only minutes earlier. Yet everyone in the room was looking at her, as if she belonged at the negotiation table. "If it helps," she said softly, "I can try." The executive displayed notes from an earlier meeting in Tokyo. Naomi read the translated summary first. Then she reviewed the original Japanese remarks. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "This section is incorrect." The room immediately leaned closer. "How?" Victoria asked. Naomi pointed toward the screen. "The original statement praised your company's willingness to share leadership responsibilities." She paused. "The translated version says they questioned your willingness to share leadership responsibilities." Silence filled the room. One word. A single change. Yet it completely reversed the meaning. Another document appeared. Then another. Each time Naomi compared the records, the same pattern emerged. Positive comments became cautious comments. Cooperative statements became skeptical statements. Areas of agreement became areas of disagreement. Nobody needed to say what they were all beginning to think. The evidence was speaking for itself. Victoria looked toward Gavin. This time she noticed something she had missed before. Every disputed translation seemed connected to discussions that directly affected investment structures Gavin supported. The realization settled heavily in her mind. Then one of the Japanese executives quietly asked a question that froze the room. Who selected the translator for these negotiations? Several people exchanged glances. Finally, an attorney answered. The recommendation came through the advisory committee. Which committee? The executive asked. The attorney checked his notes. Then he looked up slowly. The committee chaired by Gavin Pierce. The dining hall became completely silent. And for the first time that evening, Gavin Pierce had no immediate response. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The revelation hung over the dining hall like a storm cloud that had finally become visible to everyone. Gavin Pierce sat perfectly still. The confidence that had followed him throughout the evening was gone. Around the table, executives, attorneys, and investors exchanged uncertain glances. The Japanese delegation remained composed, but their attention had sharpened. They were no longer evaluating a business proposal. They were evaluating how the proposal itself had been handled. Victoria Sterling leaned back slightly in her chair and studied Gavin carefully. Years of leading billion-dollar negotiations had taught her that people often revealed the most when they were under pressure. Gavin attempted a smile. I am sure there is a reasonable explanation. The words sounded calm, but something underneath them felt strained. One of the Japanese executives responded politely. Then we would appreciate hearing it. Gavin cleared his throat. The translator was recommended because of his credentials. An attorney immediately opened a file. That is true, he said. However, the recommendation specifically came from your office. The room grew quiet again. Gavin nodded slowly. Because he came highly recommended. Nobody argued. Nobody agreed either. The problem was no longer about who selected the translator. The problem was the pattern everyone had just witnessed. Victoria turned toward Naomi Carter. Would you be willing to continue helping us review key discussion points? Naomi looked surprised to be asked directly by one of the most powerful executives in the room. Of course, she answered. What happened next changed the evening completely. For the first time, the Japanese delegation and Victoria's team began communicating without filters. Questions were asked directly. Answers were translated accurately. Clarifications happened immediately. Misunderstandings that had existed for months disappeared within minutes. The transformation was remarkable. Discussions that once felt tense suddenly became productive. Concerns that seemed impossible to resolve turned out to be based on incorrect assumptions. One executive from Tokyo shook his head in disbelief. This is the first time I feel we are having the same conversation. Several people laughed softly. The comment carried more truth than humor. Victoria noticed something important. Whenever Naomi translated, the atmosphere improved. Trust returned. Cooperation returned. Momentum returned. The partnership that had appeared doomed only an hour earlier suddenly looked stronger than ever. Meanwhile, Gavin spoke less and less. Each new clarification weakened positions he had previously supported. Each corrected translation exposed another unnecessary conflict. The pattern had become impossible to ignore. Finally, one senior Japanese executive closed his notebook and looked directly at Victoria. I believe many of our concerns have now been resolved. The statement immediately changed the energy in the room. Victoria smiled for the first time all evening. I am glad to hear that. The executive nodded respectfully. We are as well. Another member of the delegation added something that surprised everyone. Had Naomi not spoken tonight, I believe this partnership would have ended. Silence followed. The honesty of the statement carried tremendous weight. Naomi lowered her eyes modestly. She looked uncomfortable receiving so much attention. Yet everyone in the room knew the executive was correct. One decision. One moment of courage. One waitress choosing to speak the truth. That single action had changed the course of the entire evening. As coffee was served and conversations resumed with renewed optimism, Victoria found herself watching Naomi from across the room. Not as a waitress. Not as a member of the staff, but as the person who had quietly saved a partnership worth billions of dollars. And deep down, Victoria suspected the evening's biggest revelation was still waiting to emerge. The evening continued long after the tension had faded, but nobody in the room would remember the expensive dinner, the skyline views, or the polished presentations. They would remember the moment a waitress changed everything. Conversations that had once felt cautious now flowed naturally across the table. The Japanese delegation and Victoria Sterling's team spoke openly, asking questions directly and receiving answers that finally reflected their true intentions. What had begun as a partnership drifting toward failure had become something stronger because it was now built on understanding instead of assumptions. Near the end of the evening, the final documents were reviewed once more. This time, every key point was discussed openly. Every concern was addressed. Every expectation was clarified. When the senior executive from Tokyo finally extended his hand toward Victoria, a smile appeared on his face that had been absent all night. "I believe we have the foundation for an excellent partnership," he said. Victoria shook his hand warmly. "I believe so too." Around the room, quiet applause followed. Investors relaxed. Attorneys exchanged relieved smiles. Months of uncertainty had finally been resolved. Yet Victoria's attention kept returning to Naomi Carter. The waitress had quietly stepped back toward the service area after helping complete the discussions. She seemed perfectly content to disappear into the background again, as if none of this had anything to do with her. Victoria found that impossible to accept. Before the evening ended, she stood from her chair and addressed the room. The conversation stopped immediately. "Before we conclude tonight," she said, "there is someone who deserves recognition." Every eye turned toward Naomi. The waitress looked genuinely surprised. Victoria smiled. "This partnership exists tonight because one person had the courage to speak when remaining silent would have been easier." The room became quiet. She protected the truth even when she had nothing to gain from doing so. Several members of the Japanese delegation nodded immediately. One executive began applauding. Then another. Within seconds, the entire room joined them. Naomi stood frozen, her face filled with disbelief. She had never expected attention. She had certainly never expected appreciation from some of the most influential people in international business. When the applause finally faded, Victoria asked a question that had been on her mind all evening. "Naomi, may I ask something?" Naomi nodded. "Of course." Victoria smiled gently. "With your education, your experience, and your talent, why are you working as a waitress?" A soft laugh escaped Naomi before she answered. "Because life takes unexpected turns. Sometimes you do what you need to do while waiting for the next opportunity." The answer carried no bitterness, no regret, just honesty. Victoria nodded slowly. "Then perhaps tonight is one of those opportunities." Naomi looked confused. Victoria reached into her jacket and handed her a business card. "If you are interested, I would like you to meet with my executive team next week." Naomi stared at the card. For a moment, she seemed unable to speak. The room watched quietly. "Thank you," she finally said. Victoria smiled. "No, thank you." Later that night, as guests departed beneath the lights of Manhattan, the partnership moved forward stronger than ever. The investigation into the translation discrepancies would continue, and many difficult questions still remained. But one truth had already become clear. The most valuable person in the room had not been the billionaire CEO, not the investors, not the attorneys, not the executives. It had been the woman carrying a serving tray who refused to let the truth disappear. Because intelligence does not always sit at the head of the table. Sometimes it is quietly serving the table until the moment the world finally notices.